Hey everyone. Thanks for being here today. I want to talk with you about a story hiding in plain sight, completely overshadowed by the loud headlines about the US and China. While the world's attention has been fixated on that superpower rivalry, a single island nation has quietly pulled off something staggering. They have amassed the largest for an asset portfolio in human history. We are talking about over $3 trillion. For more than 30 consecutive years, this nation has held the undisputed title of the world's top creditor. That nation is Japan. Before we go any further, let me ask you something real quick. And just think about it for a second. When you hear the words Japanese economy, what is the first phrase that comes to mind? You probably thought of the word stagnant, aging, or dying. For decades, you have been told Japan is a cautionary tale, crippled by a shrinking population and an economy that stopped growing in the 90 seconds. But what if this widely accepted narrative is actually blinding us to a silent, radical resurgence? What if what we have been calling stagnation is actually a highly controlled stabilization? We need to talk through what is happening beneath the surface, because the reality is far more powerful than the myth. So, let us look at the baseline. How things have operated for a long time. For 30 years, Japan has been trapped in the lost decades. It felt stuck in another era, operating under a deeply entrenched deflationary mindset. Imagine an entire corporate culture terrified of taking risks. Instead of investing profits into new ideas or higher wages, companies became obsessed with hyper-conservative saving. They hoarded massive piles of cash. And, while they sat on all this money, the central bank kept interest rates essentially at zero. On paper, this was supposed to encourage borrowing, but what it actually did was keep a vast network of zombie companies alive, businesses that barely made enough to cover the interest on their debts. Unable to grow, unable to die, and the domestic consumer market just sat there, frozen. Families stopped spending because prices were always expected to fall tomorrow. The entire economy was holding its breath. Think of this 30-year baseline not as a fragile house of cards, but as a massive, heavily armored concrete vault. Japan built a structure invincible to global financial shocks. When markets panicked, that vault held strong because it was packed to the ceiling with internal savings. But here is the problem with a giant concrete vault. It is completely rigid. All that incredible kinetic energy, trillions of dollars in corporate capital, was trapped inside behind thick steel doors. It was perfectly safe, but generated zero forward momentum. Nothing was growing. It was just sitting in the dark. But then something shifted. A dual stress or hit the vault from the inside and the outside. First, the Tokyo Stock Exchange finally had enough. They looked at companies hoarding mountains of cash and said, "You have to stop this." They initiated aggressive corporate governance reforms, penalizing businesses that just sat on their money. They started naming and shaming the worst offenders to force them to use that capital. Right at that exact moment, the outside world knocked on the door. We are talking about the massive geopolitical shift known as friendshoring. Western supply chains, terrified of relying on China, desperately needed a highly advanced, reliable ally to build critical technologies. They needed a secure manufacturing hub, and Japan was standing right there. So what happens when you apply regulatory pressure from the inside and overwhelming global demand from the outside? The vault begins to unlock. The immediate reaction on the ground has been explosive. Japanese corporations, the ones that spent 3 decades terrified to spend a dime, are suddenly executing record-breaking share buybacks. They are unwinding those tangled, Inefficient cross-shareholdings that kept the old system running. But the most tangible change, the one that affects people walking down the street, is what is happening with paychecks. To compete in this high-stakes environment and retain local talent, companies just initiated the highest domestic wage hike seen in over 30 years. They are finally opening the vault and letting cash flow to regular workers. But to really understand how massive this shift is, we have to look past the noisy headlines about stock exchanges and interest rates. We need to step off the trading floor and walk directly into the intensely quiet, hyper-specialized factory floors scattered across Japan. Think about those hidden corporate boardrooms where decisions are not made about flashy consumer gadgets, but about the exact microscopic chemicals and precision machinery that make the modern world function. This is where the real leverage lies. It is no longer about selling millions of televisions to the masses. It is about dominating the absolute foundation of global manufacturing. Watch how this internal chain reaction unfolds step by step. When regulators force these companies to finally care about capital efficiency, that hoarded cash has to go somewhere. It gets injected directly into wages. For the first time in a generation, people are taking home noticeably more money. When a family suddenly has breathing room in their budget, they spend it. That localized spending starts a fire under domestic purchasing power. And that right there is the exact spark needed to shatter the 30-year psychological barrier of deflation. People stop waiting for prices to drop tomorrow and start buying today. Prices rise naturally. Wages rise to match. And suddenly you have organic, sustainable growth. The domestic engine actually has a pulse again. Now run that exact same sequence on a global scale. We are watching the world's major technology supply chains actively, urgently decouple from China. Western capital is scrambling. They are looking at the map, demanding a manufacturing hub that is not just highly advanced, but politically stable and undeniably allied. So, where does all that global reliance shift? It funnels straight into Japan's hyper-specialized ecosystem. We are talking about the ultra-pure photoassists needed to etch semiconductors, the high-end industrial robotics assembling electric vehicles, and the precision optics inside the machines that build microchips. Japan does not just participate in this new tech economy. By holding the patents and the tightly guarded production lines for these impossible-to-replicate components, they have quietly engineered themselves into the single most indispensable bottleneck on the planet. If you want to build the future of technology, you literally cannot do it without going through them. To understand who actually runs this new system, we have to break these players into 3 distinct, fascinating groups. First, you have the choke points. These are the niche manufacturers holding absolute global monopolies on things most of us will never see, like the invisible chemicals required to print microchips. They are the toll booths of the modern economy. Next, you have the web spinners. Think of the massive trading houses, the Sogo Shosha. They do not just trade goods. They control sprawling, global networks of energy, minerals, and food. They are the quiet architects of global supply lines, ensuring resources keep flowing their way. Finally, the value extractors. These are the reformed domestic mega banks and corporations we saw opening the vault, taking decades of hoarded capital and deploying it for high-yield returns instead of letting it rot in a zero-interest savings account. When you step back and put these pieces together, a completely new four-national power emerges. Add up the unlocking of corporate capital, multiply it by absolute dominance over supply chain choke points, and combine it with the geopolitical rush of friendshoring. What you get is the blueprint for a post-demographic superpower. For a long time, we assumed that to be an economic titan, a country needed a constantly exploding population and endless cheap labor. Japan is proving that assumption completely wrong. They are showing us that future economic supremacy relies on extreme capital efficiency and absolute indispensability. You do not need the most people if you make the one thing everyone else needs. And that brings us right back to where we started. To that staggering $3 trillion mountain of foreign assets, while the rest of the world was looking the other way, writing them off as a stagnant, aging society waiting for the end. Japan quietly pulled off one of the greatest economic pivots in history. They stopped trying to be the loud, high-volume factory of the world. Instead, they reached into themselves into the world's most lucrative, heavily optimized, and structurally invincible creditor. The vault is open, the gears are turning, and the hidden transformation is complete. In the end, the nation we thought was stuck in the past might just be holding the master key to the future.